Hello everyone and welcome back to Terrifying Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you will enjoy this video.
Story 1. The forest loomed ahead, its towering pines swaying gently in the breeze. Emma adjusted her backpack and glanced at her three friends, Jason, Lily, and Noah, who were equally eager for their weekend camping trip. "I heard this place is called the Whispering Woods," Lily said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Apparently people hear strange voices at night." Jason rolled his eyes. "Let me guess, another urban legend?" "We've heard those 100 times." Emma smirked but felt a chill creep up her spine. She loved ghost stories, but there was something unsettling about the dense, shadowy trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. Noah, always the skeptic, laughed. "I'm sure the scariest thing we'll find here is a raccoon stealing our snacks." By late afternoon, they reached a clearing and set up their tents. The setting sun painted the sky with hues of orange and purple, casting eerie shadows across the woods. They gathered around a small fire, sharing jokes and roasting marshmallows. As darkness fell, the forest grew silent. Too silent. It was Jason who heard it first, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. He tilted his head, trying to catch it again, but it was gone. Shaking it off, he returned to the group's conversation. But then Emma froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes darting toward the trees. The others fell silent, straining to listen. Faint whispers floated through the air, like distant voices carried by the wind. They were too soft to make out, but they were undeniably there. "Probably just the wind," Noah said, though his voice wavered slightly. Emma frowned. "Wind doesn't sound like words." The whispers grew louder, as if drawn to their campfire. They seemed to come from every direction, weaving together into an unsettling symphony. The words were indistinct, but eerily melodic, like a chant. "Okay, that's creepy," Lily admitted, scooting closer to the fire. Jason stood, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Maybe someone's playing a prank. Let's check it out." Reluctantly, the group followed him into the woods, their flashlights casting long, jittery beams of light. The whispers seemed to recede, pulling them deeper into the forest. After walking for what felt like an hour, they realized they couldn't hear the campfire crackling behind them anymore. The whispers had stopped too, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Does anyone know how to get back?" Lily asked nervously. Jason frowned. "We didn't go that far. The camp should be right." He turned in a slow circle, confusion spreading across his face. The woods all looked the same, endless rows of trees stretching into darkness. "We'll retrace our steps," Emma said, trying to stay calm. "Just keep moving." But as they walked, nothing looked familiar. Panic began to set in when they stumbled upon a tree marked with a deep, fresh scratch, one they swore they had passed earlier. "We're going in circles," Noah muttered, his usual confidence replaced by fear. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time the voices seemed closer, almost as if they were right behind the group. Jason spun around, shining his flashlight wildly, but the beam revealed nothing but empty woods. "Hello?" he called out. "Who's there?" The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then a branch snapped in the distance. "Okay, we need to leave. Now," Emma said, her voice trembling. They quickened their pace, stumbling over roots and rocks. Lily clutched Noah's arm, her breathing ragged. The darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. As they hurried on, Emma noticed something strange. The trees seemed wrong. Their trunks were twisted, their branches curling unnaturally. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. Just when they thought they were alone, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothing, her long hair matted with leaves and dirt. Her pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft and haunting. Relief washed over the group. "Yes," Emma exclaimed. "Can you help us find our camp?" The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her hollow eyes. "Follow me." Without waiting for a response, she turned and began walking. The group hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances, but desperation drove them to follow. As they trailed behind her, the whispers grew louder again. Emma noticed something horrifying. The woman's feet didn't touch the ground. "Guys," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Look at her feet." Jason's flashlight trembled in his hand as he shone it on the woman. She turned her head slightly, her smile widening unnaturally. Her eyes were black voids. "Run!" Noah shouted. The group sprinted through the forest, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. The whispers became a cacophony, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jason tripped over a root and fell, scraping his knee. Emma helped him up, but when she glanced back, the woman was gone. "Did we lose her?" Lily panted, clutching her side. "I don't know," Noah replied. "But we can't stop. Keep moving." They stumbled into a clearing, their flashlights flickering. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree with gnarled branches that seemed to claw at the sky. Hanging from its limbs were crude wooden dolls, swaying gently despite the still air. "What is this?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The whispers coalesced into a single chilling phrase. "Join us." Panic erupted. Jason grabbed a branch from the ground, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back," he yelled, though there was no one in sight. The group huddled together, their backs against the twisted tree. The shadows around them began to move, taking on vague, humanoid shapes. "We're not going to make it out of here," Lily sobbed. "No," Emma said firmly. "We will. We just have to stick together." She remembered the stories about the Whispering Woods. The legend claimed the forest preyed on fear. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward. "We're not afraid of you," she shouted into the darkness. The shadows paused as if uncertain. The whispers faltered, their harmony breaking. "Keep going," Noah urged. "Tell them we're not scared." "We're leaving and you can't stop us," Emma added, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. The forest seemed to shudder, the shadows retreating slightly. The whispers faded, replaced by a low, mournful wail. A sudden gust of wind extinguished their flashlights, plunging them into darkness. But when the wind died, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a flickering light. "The campfire!" Jason exclaimed. They ran toward the light, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting with each step. The whispers grew fainter until they vanished entirely. Bursting into the clearing, they found their campfire still burning. Relief flooded them as they collapsed onto the ground. As they packed up their things the next morning, none of them spoke about the night before. The forest seemed ordinary in the daylight, the sinister atmosphere gone. But as they left the Whispering Woods, Emma glanced back one last time. For a split second, she thought she saw the ghostly woman watching them from the shadows, her hollow eyes glinting with malice. The forest whispered one final time, its haunting chant echoing in Emma's mind. Until next time. Story 2. Rachel was stranded at an empty train station late at night, the cold biting through her thin jacket. She had miscalculated the last train's departure time and was now stuck in the middle of nowhere. The platform was eerily silent, lit by a few dim flickering bulbs. She pulled out her phone, but the signal was weak, and the nearest hotel was miles away. She sighed in frustration, pacing back and forth to stay warm. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the platform, and a low rumble sounded in the distance. She turned toward the tracks and froze. A train was approaching, completely unexpected. Its black steel body gleamed under the pale moonlight, and its headlights pierced the darkness like the eyes of a predator. As it slowed to a stop, Rachel noticed its outdated design, more fitting for a museum than modern railways. The train's sign simply read, "Midnight Train," with no destination listed. The door creaked open, revealing a conductor dressed in an old-fashioned uniform. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of his cap, but his voice was warm and inviting. "Need a ride, miss?" he asked, tipping his hat. Rachel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to decline, but the freezing wind and her desperation for shelter won out. "Yes, thank you." She stepped aboard, her boots clicking on the polished wooden floor. The interior was lavish yet strange, with velvet seats and golden fixtures that seemed out of place in the modern world. As the train lurched forward, Rachel realized she was the only passenger. The train moved swiftly, cutting through the night like a blade. Rachel tried to relax, grateful for the warmth, but an uneasiness settled over her. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. She decided to explore, hoping to find someone else aboard. Walking through the dimly lit compartments, she passed rows of empty seats and tables, set for meals that had long since gone cold. Finally, in the third car, she found someone, a man in a dark suit sitting perfectly still. "Hello," Rachel said cautiously. The man turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening." His voice was deep and formal, but something about him felt off. His clothes were immaculate, yet they looked as though they belonged to another era. "Where are you headed?" Rachel asked, trying to make conversation. "Wherever the train takes me," he replied cryptically. Before she could press further, another passenger appeared, a woman in a red dress. Her eyes were piercing, and her movements were graceful yet unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "Welcome to the midnight train," the woman said with a strange smile. "Few have the privilege of boarding." Rachel frowned. "Privilege? I just needed a ride." The woman chuckled, her laughter echoing unnervingly. "Oh, you'll see soon enough." As the night wore on, Rachel noticed more peculiarities. The train's windows reflected not the outside world, but warped images of herself, distorted and unsettling. When she glanced at her watch, the time was frozen at exactly midnight. The conductor reappeared, moving silently through the aisle. "Care for a refreshment, miss?" he asked, holding a tray of ornate teacups. Rachel shook her head, her stomach churning with anxiety. "Where is this train going?" He smiled. "Where it's meant to." Unsatisfied, Rachel returned to her seat, but the discomfort grew. The man in the dark suit and the woman in the red dress seemed to follow her without moving, their presence unnervingly constant. Desperate for answers, Rachel confronted them. "What is this place? Why are we here?" The man's smile widened. "This train is not bound by ordinary destinations. It carries those who are in transition." "In transition?" The woman leaned closer. "You've crossed a threshold, dear. This is no ordinary train. It ferries souls." Rachel's breath caught. "Souls? Are you saying I'm dead?" The woman tilted her head. "Not quite. You're at a crossroads." The words triggered a flood of memories. Rachel recalled walking home after a long day, the glare of headlights, the screech of tires, and the impact that sent her spinning into darkness. "I was in an accident," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Indeed," the man confirmed. "This train is a liminal space, a bridge between life and death. You're here because your fate has not yet been decided." Rachel's heart raced. "Then I can go back? I can return to my life?" The woman in the red dress smiled sadly. "Perhaps. But first, you must face what lies ahead." The train screeched to a halt, and the conductor announced their first stop. Rachel peered out the window to see a desolate landscape bathed in eerie blue light. Shadows flitted across the barren ground, their forms shifting and unrecognizable. "You must disembark," the conductor said. "Why?" "To confront your past," he replied. Reluctantly, Rachel stepped off the train. The air was thick and cold, and the shadows began to coalesce into shapes, familiar ones. They were scenes from her life, moments she had long buried. She saw herself arguing with her mother, saying hurtful things she could never take back. She saw the friend she had abandoned in a moment of need, her face etched with disappointment. Each vision pierced her heart, a reminder of the mistakes she had made. The shadows spoke, their voices accusatory. "You were selfish. You caused pain. Do you deserve a second chance?" Tears streamed down Rachel's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The shadows loomed closer, their judgment palpable. But then, a warm light began to glow from within her, pushing them back. Back on the train, Rachel was drained, but determined. The man in the suit and the woman in red seemed pleased. "You're stronger than most," the man said. The train stopped again, this time at a bridge suspended over a swirling void. The conductor handed Rachel a key. "This is your choice," he said. "The door at the end of this car leads back to the world of the living, but the path is not without its price." Rachel gripped the key tightly and walked to the final car. The door was massive, adorned with intricate carvings of life and death. As she inserted the key, the train shuddered violently. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding light. But before she could step through, the woman in red appeared one last time. "Remember," she said, her voice soft but firm, "life is a gift, and every moment matters. Use it wisely." Rachel awoke in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling her nostrils. Machines beeped around her, and a nurse gasped as she opened her eyes. "You're awake." Her body ached, and her mind was foggy, but Rachel was alive. Her family rushed in, tears streaming down their faces as they hugged her. As she recovered, Rachel couldn't forget the midnight train. The passengers, the trials, and the choices she had faced were etched into her memory. She vowed to live differently, cherishing every moment and making amends for her past mistakes. But sometimes, late at night, she would hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, a haunting reminder of the journey she had taken and the lesson she would never forget. Story 3. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the Martin family moved into their new home, an old Victorian house on the edge of town. The place had charm, with its ornate gables and sprawling yard, but it also had an air of melancholy that clung to its weathered walls. As they unpacked, 8-year-old Sophie wandered into the attic, drawn by curiosity. The space was dimly lit, with beams of light slicing through the cracks in the wooden slats, illuminating dust motes in the air. Sophie's eyes scanned the room, landing on a pile of forgotten belongings shoved into a corner. Among the old books, faded photographs, and broken toys, she found a doll. It was no ordinary doll. Its porcelain face was painted with delicate features, framed by curls of jet black hair. Its glassy blue eyes seemed almost lifelike, staring unblinkingly ahead. The doll wore a lace dress, yellowed with age, and its tiny hands were molded in an almost lifelike grip. "Mom, look what I found!" Sophie called, running downstairs with the doll cradled in her arms. Her mother, Claire, looked up from unpacking. "Oh, that's a pretty doll, honey. Where did you find it?" "In the attic," Sophie replied, beaming. "Can I keep it?" Claire hesitated, glancing at the doll. There was something unsettling about its stare, but she dismissed the feeling as irrational. "Sure, but make sure to clean it first." Sophie nodded enthusiastically and took the doll to her room. She placed it on a shelf above her bed, where it seemed to watch over her. That night, as the family settled into their new home, the first strange thing happened. Sophie woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint whispers. Groggy and confused, she sat up, scanning the room. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The next morning, Sophie told her parents about the whispers, but they chalked it up to her imagination. "It's probably just the house settling," Claire reassured her. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie grew more attached to the doll, naming it Maggie. She talked to it as if it were a real friend, sharing her thoughts and secrets. But the whispers returned, growing louder and more frequent. At first they were barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. Then they became distinct words, spoken in a soft, sing-song voice. "Play with me, Sophie." One evening, Sophie's older brother Jake teased her about the doll. "That thing's creepy," he said, poking at it. "I bet it's haunted." Sophie glared at him. "Leave Maggie alone. She's my friend." Jake laughed, but as he walked away, he swore he felt the doll's eyes follow him. That night, he dreamed of the doll, its porcelain face twisted into a sinister grin as it whispered his name. The following morning, strange occurrences began to escalate. Objects in the house moved on their own. Lights flickered without reason. Sophie's room was the epicenter of the activity. Her toys were often found scattered in odd patterns, as if arranged by an unseen hand. Once Claire walked in to find Maggie sitting in the middle of the floor, even though Sophie swore she hadn't moved her. Concerned, Claire decided to inspect the doll more closely. She examined its face, its delicate hands, and its lace dress. As she turned it over, she noticed something strange carved into the porcelain base of its neck, an intricate symbol she didn't recognize. It sent a chill down her spine. That evening, Claire mentioned the doll to her husband, Mark. "I think we should get rid of it," she said. "It's making Sophie act different." Mark raised an eyebrow. "It's just a doll, Claire. You're overthinking it." But Claire couldn't shake her unease. She decided to do some research on the house and its previous owners. At the local library, she uncovered a newspaper article from decades ago. It detailed the tragic story of a little girl named Margaret who had lived in the house. Margaret had died mysteriously at the age of 8, and her favorite possession had been a porcelain doll. Claire's blood ran cold. Could it be the same doll? She returned home and told Mark what she had discovered. He laughed it off, but Claire was determined to protect her family. That night, she entered Sophie's room while her daughter slept and took the doll. She locked it in a box and placed it in the attic, hoping to end the strange events. But the next morning, Maggie was back on Sophie's shelf. "Mom, why did you take Maggie?" Sophie asked, tears in her eyes. "She told me you tried to hide her." Claire's heart sank. "What do you mean, Sophie? How did Maggie tell you?" Sophie looked at her mother with a mix of confusion and fear. "She talks to me. She says she'll be my best friend forever." Claire decided enough was enough. She grabbed the doll and told Sophie it was going away for good. Sophie screamed and cried, begging her mother not to take Maggie, but Claire was resolute. She drove to the edge of town and threw the doll into a dumpster. That night, the house was eerily quiet. Claire felt a sense of relief, believing the nightmare was over. But at 3 a.m., she woke to the sound of Sophie laughing. Alarmed, she rushed to her daughter's room. Sophie was sitting on the floor playing with Maggie. Claire gasped, "How did you get that back?" Sophie looked up, her eyes glassy, and spoke in a voice that wasn't her own. "I told you, Mommy. Maggie doesn't like being left behind." Claire backed away, her hands trembling. She called Mark, who immediately contacted a local priest. The priest arrived the next day, his face grim as he examined the doll. "This isn't just a toy," he said. "It's a vessel. Something dark is attached to it." The priest performed a blessing and suggested burning the doll. Reluctantly, the family built a fire in their backyard and threw Maggie into the flames. As the doll's porcelain face cracked and melted, a high-pitched scream echoed through the air, leaving everyone shaken. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. The house felt lighter, and Sophie seemed like her old self again, but Claire couldn't forget the haunting events. She often found herself checking Sophie's shelf, half expecting to see Maggie sitting there. Years later, the Martin family moved away, hoping to leave the past behind. But rumors persisted about the old Victorian house. New owners claimed to hear whispers in the attic, and some even reported finding a porcelain doll with black curls and blue eyes, sitting quietly, waiting for its next friend. Story 4. The forest had always held a certain mystique for the villagers of Black Hollow. It stretched endlessly, a dense labyrinth of towering trees that whispered with the wind. The locals had a name for it, the Forbidden Woods. Tales of the place were woven into the fabric of the village, warnings passed down through generations. They spoke of people who wandered too far and never returned, of shadows that didn't belong to trees, and of a presence that watched from the depths of the forest. Eleanor was new to Black Hollow, having moved there to escape the chaos of city life. She had inherited her grandmother's cottage, a quaint little home at the edge of the woods. Despite the village's warnings, Eleanor found herself drawn to the forest. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the noise she had left behind. She often sat on her porch, sipping tea and staring into the endless green. Something about it seemed to call to her. One afternoon, she decided to explore. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light through the leaves. Eleanor grabbed her camera, thinking she might capture the forest's beauty. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. As she ventured deeper, the path beneath her feet became less defined, twisting and narrowing. Despite the isolation, she felt oddly comforted, as though the forest were embracing her. Hours passed without her realizing it. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched across the forest floor. Eleanor decided it was time to head back. But as she turned to retrace her steps, she froze. The path she had been following was gone. The forest had changed. Trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward her. Panic began to set in as she turned in circles, unable to find any familiar markers. She called out, her voice swallowed by the thick silence. The forest seemed alive, breathing around her, its stillness heavy with intent. Then she heard it, a faint, melodic humming. It was soft, almost ethereal, but it sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, only that it was moving closer. Despite her fear, curiosity pulled her forward. Following the sound, she stumbled upon a clearing bathed in silver moonlight. In the center stood an ancient tree, its twisted roots snaking into the ground like veins. Its bark was carved with symbols she didn't recognize, glowing faintly in the darkness. Beneath the tree was a figure, a woman cloaked in shadows. Her face was obscured, but her presence was commanding, almost otherworldly. "Welcome, traveler," the woman said, her voice smooth and melodic. "You've come far." "I didn't mean to," Eleanor stammered. "I'm lost." The woman chuckled softly, a sound that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "No one enters these woods by accident. You were meant to find me." Eleanor's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. "Who are you?" she managed to ask. "I am the keeper of the forest," the woman replied, "and you have trespassed." "I didn't mean to," Eleanor repeated. "I'll leave. Just show me the way back." The keeper tilted her head, considering. "The forest does not take kindly to intruders, but perhaps you can earn your passage." Before Eleanor could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to shift. Roots emerged from the soil, writhing like snakes, encircling her ankles. She struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter they gripped. The keeper raised a hand, and the roots released her, but they remained coiled around her feet, a silent warning. "There is a task you must complete," the keeper said. Deep within the forest lies an ancient relic, a fragment of what once bound this land to the mortal world. Bring it to me, and you may leave. Eleanor hesitated. And if I refuse? The keeper's shadowed face seemed to darken further. Then you will remain here. Forever. With no other choice, Eleanor agreed. The keeper gestured to a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest. Follow this, but beware. Others have tried and failed. The path was treacherous, winding through thick underbrush and over uneven ground. The forest grew darker with every step, the trees pressing closer together. Eleanor's heart pounded as strange noises echoed around her. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, whispers just out of reach. She felt as though she were being watched, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. Eventually, she reached a cave hidden beneath a tangle of roots. The entrance was small, barely wide enough to squeeze through. As she crawled inside, the air grew cold and damp, carrying the metallic scent of earth and decay. The cave was a maze of tunnels, lit faintly by an eerie blue glow emanating from the walls. The whispers grew louder here, forming unintelligible words that seemed to come from the stones themselves. At the heart of the cave, she found the relic, a small crystalline orb resting on a pedestal of stone. Its surface pulsed with a soft inner light, casting shifting patterns on the walls. Eleanor hesitated. The orb was mesmerizing, but something about it felt wrong, as if it were alive and aware of her presence. She reached out to take it, and the moment her fingers touched the cool surface, the cave erupted with noise. A deafening roar filled the air, and the walls began to tremble. Shadows poured from the cracks in the stone, coalescing into humanoid forms with glowing red eyes. They surged toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural. Eleanor clutched the orb and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she navigated the twisting tunnels. The shadows pursued her relentlessly, their guttural growls echoing in the confined space. She emerged from the cave just as one of them lunged, its clawed hand brushing against her shoulder. The sunlight seemed to repel them, and they retreated into the darkness with anguished shrieks. She didn't stop running until she reached the clearing. The keeper was waiting, her shadowy form more defined now, almost human. Eleanor handed her the orb, her hands trembling. The keeper cradled it like a precious treasure, her voice soft with satisfaction. "You have done well," she said. "The forest acknowledges your bravery." "Can I go now?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The keeper smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor saw her face. A pale, ageless visage with eyes that seemed to hold the entire forest within them. "Yes, but remember, the forest has marked you. You will never truly leave." The roots released Eleanor, and the trees parted to reveal a clear path back to her grandmother's cottage. She didn't look back, afraid of what she might see. When she reached the safety of her home, she collapsed onto the porch, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. In the days that followed, Eleanor tried to convince herself it had all been a bad dream. But the forest loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of what had happened. And sometimes, late at night, she would hear the melodic humming again, drifting through her window on the wind. Story 5. The storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds swallowing the sky and turning day into an eerie twilight. Thunder growled in the distance, and the wind howled through the small seaside town of Crestwood. It was the kind of storm that seemed alive, electric and ominous, sending shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned sailors. By the time the rain began to fall in sheets, the lighthouse on the edge of the cliff stood as the town's only beacon of hope. Its rotating light pierced the gloom, a steady rhythm of reassurance for ships navigating the treacherous waters below. The lighthouse keeper, an old man named Edgar, had maintained its glow for decades, his life as consistent and unyielding as the tides. But that night, something changed. Edgar peered through the thick glass of the lantern room, watching the storm rage. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, spraying foam high into the air. He took a sip of his coffee, worn hands gripping the mug tightly as he leaned against the window. Then he saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance, too low to be a star, too steady to be lightning. He narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to the glass. The light hovered just above the waterline, growing brighter with each passing moment. Edgar grabbed his binoculars, focusing on the strange glow. What he saw made his breath catch. It was a ship, but unlike any he had ever seen. Its hull was blackened and charred, the masts splintered and twisted as though they had endured centuries of punishment. Torn sails flapped like ghostly banners in the storm's wind, and the light emanated from the figurehead, a glowing orb cradled in the hands of a skeletal woman carved into the prow. Edgar's heart pounded. He had heard the stories of the Phantom Ship, a vessel said to appear in Crestwood's waters every century during the fiercest storm. It was said to be a harbinger of doom, cursed to sail forever, collecting souls to replace its crew. The townsfolk dismissed it as a tale to scare children. But standing there, watching the ship cut through the storm, Edgar knew it was no myth. He stumbled back from the window, his mind racing. The ship was heading straight for the rocks, but the storm was so fierce that no captain could possibly navigate safely. Edgar's duty was clear. He had to warn the crew. Grabbing his raincoat, he raced down the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the tower. The wind hit him like a wall as he stepped outside, rain pelting his face. He made his way to the edge of the cliff, the beam of the lighthouse cutting through the darkness above him. Cupping his hands around his mouth, he shouted into the storm, his voice barely audible above the roar of the waves. "Turn back! The rocks will tear you apart." The ship drew closer, its spectral glow casting an otherworldly light on the water. Edgar realized, with growing dread, that it wasn't slowing down. Instead, it seemed to glide effortlessly over the waves, untouched by the storm. As it neared the shore, the light from the orb grew blinding, forcing Edgar to shield his eyes. When he looked again, the ship was gone. In its place stood a group of figures, silhouetted against the glow. They were tall and gaunt, their features obscured by cloaks that billowed in the wind. Edgar's instinct was to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot as the figures began to move toward him. "Keeper of the Light," one of them spoke, the voice hollow and echoing as if coming from the depths of the sea. "Your time has come." Edgar swallowed hard. "What do you want?" "The light you tend is more than a guide for the living," the figure continued. "It is a beacon for the lost, a tether to the world they cannot leave. We have come to collect what is owed." "I don't understand," Edgar stammered. "I've kept the light burning for years. I've saved lives. And yet, you have also bound souls," another figure said, stepping forward. "Every ship saved by your light leaves behind those who were meant to perish. Their spirits linger, trapped in the current of time." Edgar shook his head, his mind reeling. The idea that his work had unintended consequences was unbearable. "What do you want me to do?" The first figure raised a bony hand, pointing toward the lighthouse. "The light must go out. Only then will the balance be restored." Edgar felt a surge of defiance. The lighthouse was his life, his responsibility. To extinguish its flame was unthinkable. "If I do that, more ships will crash. More lives will be lost." The figures were silent for a moment, their forms wavering like mist in the rain. Then the leader spoke again, his tone heavy with finality. "A choice must be made, Keeper. The light burns at the cost of many. Extinguish it, or join the crew of the Phantom Ship." Edgar's blood ran cold. He realized what they meant. If he refused, his soul would be bound to the cursed ship, condemned to wander the seas for eternity. But if he extinguished the light, he would betray everything he had ever stood for. The figures began to retreat, their forms fading into the storm. "You have until the storm's end to decide," the leader said, his voice carried away by the wind. Edgar stood there for what felt like hours, the storm raging around him. He thought of the lives he had saved, the ships that had found safety because of his light. But he also thought of the souls he had unknowingly trapped. Their silent pleas carried on the wind. Finally, he made his decision. Climbing back into the tower, Edgar approached the lantern. The flame flickered behind the glass, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold reality of his choice. With trembling hands, he opened the chamber and let the wind snuff out the light. Darkness enveloped the room, and for a moment there was silence. Then, the storm began to abate. The wind died down, the rain lessened, and the thunder faded into the distance. Edgar stared out at the sea, where the phantom ship appeared once more. This time, it seemed different, less menacing, almost peaceful. The figures aboard nodded in silent acknowledgement before the ship dissolved into the horizon, taking with it the weight of its curse. The lighthouse never shone again. Edgar stayed in the tower, a solitary figure haunted by the choice he had made. Some say he lived out the rest of his days in quiet penance, while others claim he vanished one night, his lantern found burning once more in the ghostly glow of the storm. The tale of Edgar and the phantom ship became another story for the people of Crestwood, a warning about the price of duty and the delicate balance between life and death. And on stormy nights, some swear they can still see the faint outline of a ship on the horizon, its spectral light guiding the lost back to the depths. Story 6. The orb sat on Eleanor's shelf, its soft, pulsing light casting eerie patterns on the walls of her grandmother's cottage. She had brought it back from the forest to earn her freedom, completing the task the keeper had set before her. But even now, safe in her home, she couldn't shake the sense of unease. The forest had warned her, through whispers in the trees and shadows that didn't belong, that taking the orb would have consequences. In the days following her return, Eleanor noticed strange occurrences. The forest, which had always been a distant, looming presence, seemed to creep closer each time she glanced out the window. The line of trees appeared darker, thicker, and more alive. Vines crawled over the fence posts, and strange birds circled her cottage, their cries unsettling and unfamiliar. Eleanor tried to ignore the orb, covering it with a cloth to block out its glow, but at night she dreamed of it. In her dreams, the keeper's face appeared, pale and ageless, with eyes like bottomless pools of darkness. "You think you've escaped," the keeper whispered, her voice echoing in Eleanor's mind. "But the forest never forgets, and neither does the orb." One night, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere, Eleanor decided to bury the orb. Perhaps getting rid of it would sever whatever connection she still had to the forest. She grabbed a spade and the orb, heading to the far side of the village where the ground was rocky and barren. As she dug, the wind picked up, howling like a wounded animal. It felt as if the earth itself resisted her efforts, the soil turning stubborn and unyielding. When she finally placed the orb into the shallow hole and covered it with dirt, the wind stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then a deep rumble rose from the earth, and cracks spiderwebbed across the ground. The orb burst through the soil, unharmed, its glow brighter than ever. Eleanor stumbled back, her heart racing as the ground sealed itself, leaving no trace of her attempt to bury it. Panic gripped her. She couldn't return it to the keeper, not after what she had gone through to escape the forest, but keeping it meant inviting more strange events into her life. That night, she resolved to learn the truth about the orb. If she couldn't get rid of it, she needed to understand what it was and why the keeper had wanted it so badly. The village historian, an elderly man named Tobias, was known for his knowledge of local legends. Eleanor approached him the next morning, the orb wrapped in a cloth. Tobias listened intently as she recounted her experience in the forest and the task the keeper had given her. His face grew pale as she revealed the orb, its faint glow visible even through the fabric. "That," Tobias said, his voice trembling, "is the heart of the forest. It is ancient, older than this village, older than any human settlement. The legends say it is the source of the forest's life, its magic, its very soul." Eleanor's stomach sank. "Then why would the keeper ask me to take it?" Tobias shook his head. "The keeper is a guardian, but also a prisoner. The forest binds her as much as it binds the heart. Perhaps she sought to escape her role, or perhaps she wanted the heart to fall into the hands of someone who could use it. Regardless, you have upset a balance that has stood for centuries." Eleanor felt a chill run through her. "What happens if the balance isn't restored?" "The forest will wither, and with it the village," Tobias said gravely. "The heart sustains not only the forest but all life that depends on it. Without it, the land will turn barren and the keeper's wrath will grow unchecked." Eleanor's mind raced. She thought of the creeping vines, the unnatural silence of the forest, and the oppressive dreams. She realized she had no choice. She had to return the orb, even if it meant facing the keeper again. But Tobias warned her. "The forest may not let you pass so easily this time. It knows what you carry." Armed with the orb and a renewed sense of determination, Eleanor ventured back into the forbidden woods. The path that had once felt welcoming now seemed hostile. The trees pressed closer, their branches clawing at her like skeletal fingers. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling her mind with incoherent murmurs. Shadows darted at the edges of her vision, and the air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. As she pushed deeper into the forest, she felt the orb grow warm in her hands. Its light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, as though it were alive and aware of its impending return. The forest responded to the orb's presence, the ground trembling beneath her feet and the wind carrying the sound of distant wailing. Finally, she reached the clearing where the ancient tree stood, its twisted roots reaching into the earth like veins. The keeper was there, her shadowy form more imposing than before. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her voice was cold and sharp. "You've returned, but not unscathed." Eleanor stepped forward, holding the orb out. "You told me to take this, but you didn't tell me what it would cost." The keeper's lips curved into a faint smile. "And yet, you brought it back. Perhaps you understand now that some burdens are not meant to be carried by mortals." "Why did you send me after it?" Eleanor demanded, her voice shaking. "What was the point of all this?" "To test you," the keeper said simply. "The heart cannot remain in the forest without a guardian, and my time here grows short. The forest chose you, Eleanor, though you did not know it. By taking the heart and returning it, you have proven yourself worthy." Eleanor stared at the keeper, her mind reeling. "I don't want to be a guardian. I just want my life back." The keeper's expression softened, though her otherworldly presence remained. "We seldom choose our paths, but we can choose how we walk them. The forest needs someone to protect it, to ensure its balance. You have already begun that journey, whether you realize it or not." The orb seemed to hum in Eleanor's hands, its warmth seeping into her skin. She felt a strange connection to it, a sense of belonging she couldn't explain. Despite her fear, she nodded. "What do I have to do?" The keeper stepped aside, gesturing to the ancient tree. "Place the heart where it belongs. The forest will do the rest." Eleanor approached the tree, her hands trembling as she set the orb into a hollow in its trunk. The moment the orb settled into place, the forest came alive. The ground pulsed with energy, the trees straightened, and a vibrant green light spread through the clearing. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. The keeper's form began to dissolve, her features softening into a smile. "Thank you, Eleanor. The forest is yours now." As the keeper vanished, Eleanor felt a surge of power course through her. She realized she could hear the forest, feel its life pulsing through her veins. She had become its guardian, bound to it in a way she could never have imagined. The forest no longer felt like a place of fear, but of purpose. And though she had not chosen this path, she knew it was hers to walk. Story 7. The village of Windfall had always been a place of quiet beauty, nestled on the edge of an expansive marsh. The homes were small but sturdy, their stone walls lined with ivy, and the cobblestone streets meandered through the village like veins in a living body. For as long as anyone could remember, the villagers had lived simple lives, unaffected by the changes of the outside world. They had a rhythm to their existence. Seasons passed, crops were harvested, and families grew, generation after generation. But for as long as they had lived there, they also carried a secret. There was something in the marsh, something ancient and powerful, that none of them dared to speak about. And yet, over the years, there were whispers. Whispers of a creature that lived in the depths of the swamp, a being whose presence was felt but never seen. Some said it was a spirit, others claimed it was a guardian, and still others insisted that it was a monster waiting for the right moment to rise and claim the village. But no matter the story, they all agreed on one thing. The creature had been there for as long as the village had, and it was not to be disturbed. It wasn't until the arrival of a stranger, a young woman named Arwen, that the legend would be forced to surface again. She arrived one autumn evening, wrapped in a heavy cloak and carrying a leather-bound journal. She had heard of Windfall's isolation and was intrigued by the idea of a village untouched by the rush of modern life. She spoke little of her past, but her curiosity was evident, especially when she asked the villagers about the marsh. "Why do you stay so close to it?" Arwen asked one evening, her voice low, as she sat with a group of villagers around a fire. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances before one of them, an older woman named Althea, spoke. "The marsh is not something to speak of lightly, child. It's been here longer than any of us, and it's better left alone." "But why?" Arwen pressed. "What do you fear?" Althea hesitated, her wrinkled hands clasping tightly around the mug of tea in her hands. "We've learned to live with it. Over the years, we've learned to respect it. To stir it is to invite trouble." Arwen was not satisfied with this answer. She spent the next few days walking the edges of the marsh, observing its still waters and the strange twisting trees that grew along its banks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the mist that often lingered made it seem as though the marsh itself were hiding something. Each time Arwen ventured closer, she felt a pull, a beckoning sensation that urged her deeper into the swamp. Yet she always turned back, sensing that there was something waiting for her in the heart of it. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, Arwen could no longer resist the pull. She packed a small bag, grabbed a lantern, and set off toward the swamp. The air was thick with fog as she stepped into the muddy earth, her boots sinking slightly with each step. The trees around her creaked in the wind, their twisted branches reaching toward her like skeletal hands. She kept her eyes focused ahead, her heart beating loudly in her chest as she pressed deeper into the marsh. The sound of her footsteps was muffled by the damp ground, and the stillness that surrounded her was both comforting and unnerving. As she walked, she began to feel a presence, something that followed her every move. It was not a sound, nor a sight, but a feeling. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and a chill ran down her spine. She paused for a moment, looking around, but there was nothing, just the fog and the trees. Her lantern flickered in the damp air, casting long shadows that danced eerily in the fog. That's when she heard it. A low, guttural growl, barely audible above the whispering of the wind. It came from the depths of the swamp, a sound unlike anything she had ever heard. Her breath caught in her throat, but she pressed on, feeling a strange mix of fear and curiosity. The growl came again, closer this time, and Arwen knew she was no longer alone. The marsh seemed to shift around her as she ventured further, the path growing narrower and the trees more twisted. The fog thickened, and her lantern's light became dimmer, as though the very air was trying to smother it. It was then that she saw it, a figure standing in the distance, half concealed by the fog. At first, she thought it was a tree, a particularly twisted branch, but as she drew closer, she saw that it was moving. It was a creature, tall and hunched, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with a faint, eerie light. It stood still, watching her, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Arwen's heart pounded in her chest, but she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze away from the creature. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, the creature tilted its head, as if it were considering her, and it stepped forward. Its movement was fluid, almost hypnotic, as it closed the distance between them. Arwen instinctively took a step back, but the creature's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt a strange connection, as though it were trying to communicate with her. It spoke, though its voice was not one that came from a mouth. The words were felt, not heard, echoing in her mind. "You are not meant to be here, human," it said, its presence overwhelming. "The marsh does not welcome you." Arwen swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered. "I just wanted to understand." The creature's eyes glowed brighter for a moment, and it seemed to consider her words. "Understand?" it asked. "You seek understanding, but you do not know the cost. The marsh is not a place of knowledge. It is a place of memory, of power long forgotten. You have touched the edges of its secrets." "I didn't mean to disturb anything," Arwen said, her voice trembling. "You have already disturbed much," the creature responded, its tone somber. "But it is not too late. Leave now, and the marsh will forget your presence. Stay, and it will claim you." Arwen's mind raced. She had no idea what this creature was or what it meant by claiming her, but she knew she didn't want to find out. The feeling of the creature's eyes on her was enough to send her heart into a frantic beat. "I will leave," she said quickly, stepping back, her feet slipping in the mud. "I will go." The creature's eyes softened, and it nodded slowly, its movements slow and deliberate. "Go then. But remember, the marsh does not forget. It waits, and it watches." Arwen turned and fled, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she was back at the edge of the village, breathless and shaken. The fog had lifted by the time she reached the village, and the moon shone brightly overhead, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the marsh. The next day, the villagers found her at the inn, pale and exhausted. She didn't speak for days, and when she finally did, she warned them. "The creature in the marsh, it's real. It doesn't want anyone to disturb it." The villagers listened to her, and though they did not speak of the creature openly, they knew that the legend had once again come to life. From that day forward, the marsh was left untouched, its secrets buried deeper than ever before. And Arwen, though she never returned to the swamp, would forever carry the memory of the creature in the depths of her mind, knowing that the marsh, with all its forgotten power, would always be waiting, watching. Story 8. The clock tower in the heart of Blackstone had stood for centuries, its timekeeping never faltering, even as the village around it had changed. It was a proud monument to the town's legacy, its stone walls worn smooth by the passing years and the elements. The tower's bell, deep and resonant, rang out every hour, marking the passage of time. But to those who lived in Blackstone, the clock tower was more than just a relic of the past. It was a symbol of something far older, something darker. There were stories, whispered only in the dead of night, about the tower's true purpose, and they had been passed down from generation to generation. One of these stories belonged to Eleanor, a young woman who had grown up in Blackstone. She had heard the tales of the clock tower's curse many times over the years, but she had never fully believed them. She dismissed them as mere superstition, remnants of a bygone age when the villagers were ruled by fear and ignorance. That was before the accident, before her life had changed forever. It was a foggy autumn evening when Eleanor's story began. The sun had set hours ago, and the streets of Blackstone were deserted, the thick fog enveloping everything in a cold, damp embrace. Eleanor had been working late at the local apothecary, her shop tucked away in a narrow alley near the base of the clock tower. As she walked home, the streets felt unusually empty. The only sound was the echo of her footsteps on the cobblestones, a rhythm that seemed to reverberate through the fog. As she passed the clock tower, she paused for a moment, looking up at its looming presence. The bell had already rung midnight, and yet she noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from the tower's high windows. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mist, but as she stared, the light grew brighter, flickering like candlelight. Her heart quickened and curiosity got the better of her. She approached the base of the tower, her breath visible in the cold air, and placed her hand against the stone wall. It felt warmer than it should have, almost alive. She stepped back, unease creeping into her chest. Without fully understanding why, Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to climb the tower. Perhaps it was the strange light, or perhaps it was the stories she had heard as a child about the tower's secrets. The elders of Blackstone had always warned her to stay away, to never venture near the tower after nightfall. But the temptation was too strong. She pulled herself together and decided to climb the steps that wound around the tower's exterior, her fingers gripping the cold, rough stone as she ascended. The higher she climbed, the more oppressive the air became. The fog seemed to grow thicker around her, and the sound of her own breathing felt too loud in the stillness. As she reached the top of the tower, she found the door to the bell chamber slightly ajar. The light she had seen earlier was now brighter, and it seemed to emanate from within the room itself. She hesitated at the threshold, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Something was wrong. The room was eerily quiet, and yet the air felt charged, as if something was watching her. With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped inside. The glow came from an old wooden chest sitting in the center of the room, its surface worn and scratched, as if it had been moved countless times. The chest was slightly open, a faint golden light spilling out from within. Eleanor approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached for the chest's lid, a cold wind rushed through the room, extinguishing the light from the lantern she had brought with her. The glow from the chest grew even brighter, blinding her for a moment. Then, in an instant, the room was plunged into darkness. Eleanor's pulse raced, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. The silence was suffocating, and for the first time she felt truly afraid. A whisper echoed in the dark, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, but it was unmistakable. "You should not have come." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, resonant, and seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. She spun around, but the darkness around her remained impenetrable. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Leave, while you still can." She didn't need to be told twice. In a panic, Eleanor rushed toward the door, but as she reached the threshold, something stopped her. A cold, clammy hand seemed to grip her ankle, pulling her back into the room. She screamed, struggling to free herself, but the grip only tightened, sending a jolt of icy terror through her. The air seemed to thicken, and the whispering grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of slow, dragging footsteps. Eleanor's mind raced. The stories her grandmother had told her as a child began to flood her thoughts. The clock tower was cursed, she remembered. The bell had not only kept time, it had kept something else at bay, a dark force trapped within the tower for centuries. And now, for the first time in years, the force had been released. With every ounce of strength, Eleanor wrenched herself free and stumbled out of the room, falling onto the stone steps that led down to the ground. She could hear the dragging footsteps behind her, relentless and slow, as if the entity in the tower was toying with her. She didn't stop running until she reached the bottom of the stairs, gasping for air. The fog had thickened even more, but she didn't care. She sprinted through the streets, her mind clouded with fear, until she finally reached the safety of her home. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window made her heart race. She knew the entity from the tower was still out there, lurking in the fog, waiting. She remembered the chest and the golden light that had spilled from it. Something inside it had been unleashed, something she couldn't begin to comprehend. In the days that followed, Eleanor's mind grew more and more consumed by the events of that night. She found herself drawn back to the clock tower, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to learn more. She couldn't explain why, but she felt a deep sense of responsibility. Whatever had been set loose was her fault, and she had to make it right. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Eleanor returned to the tower. She waited until nightfall, the moonlight barely piercing the thick fog that had rolled in again. The village was quiet, as it always was, the streets empty and still. She walked to the tower, her breath fogging in the cold air, and once again began to climb the steps. But this time she was prepared. She had a lantern, a rope, and a dagger, just in case. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she knew she had to stop whatever had been unleashed. When she reached the top, the door to the bell chamber was open, just as it had been the night before. The room was dark, but she could feel the presence within it, the air heavy and charged with energy. The chest was still there, sitting in the center of the room, but now there was something different. The golden light was gone, replaced by an eerie, pulsing red glow. The chest was closed, but it seemed to hum with a low, sinister energy. Eleanor approached the chest cautiously, the weight of her fear pressing down on her chest. She placed a hand on the lid, and as soon as she did, the whispering began again, louder this time. "You should not have come." The voice was unmistakable now. It was a voice of power, ancient and cruel, and it sent shivers down her spine. But this time Eleanor didn't hesitate. She lifted the lid of the chest, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside the chest was not treasure, nor an artifact of any kind. It was a darkness, a swirling mass of shadow and red light, writhing and pulsing as if alive. Before she could react, the darkness surged up, enveloping her in an icy grip. It was stronger than before, more powerful, and it whispered again, this time in a language Eleanor didn't understand. The words seemed to press against her mind, and she felt her consciousness slipping away. But just as she thought she would lose herself entirely, the bell of the clock tower rang out, the sound deafening and filled with an unnatural power. The darkness recoiled, the grip loosening around her, and for a brief moment, Eleanor was free. With a cry, Eleanor fled the tower, tumbling down the steps and running through the fog, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the village, and even then she could feel the presence following her, lingering in the fog, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eleanor knew she could never go back. The clock tower's curse had claimed her, and she had unwittingly unleashed something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The entity from the chest was not of this world. It was ancient, powerful, and hungry, and it would never stop until it had claimed the village of Blackstone, piece by piece. And so, the villagers of Blackstone continued to live their lives, unaware of the growing threat in the fog, the curse that had been unleashed. But Eleanor knew better now. She knew that the clock tower was not just a relic. It was a prison, and something much worse than time had been held inside it for centuries. Something that, once freed, would never stop until it had consumed everything. And it had only just begun.